today's motion is innovation made in China will change the world. I will start the very first poll. And again, please log into Slido, scan the QR code behind me, and vote. And while you do that, let me quickly outline what we are debating today. Long gone are the days of copycat China. The idea that the country mostly excels at creating cheap knockoffs of products and innovations developed in other countries. Today, Chinese companies produce innovations that can compete globally, whether it's electric vehicles, solar cells, pharmaceuticals, or cutting-edge large language models. In some way, this is not what was supposed to happen. Industrialized countries long felt certain about their advantage in producing leading technology. A democratic system and an open society were seen as a high enough moat to keep the edge. When that looked like it wouldn't work, the actual high fence from the Biden administration, consisting of export controls, followed, designed to deny China access to the most advanced technology. It's an open question if this strategy can be successful in the long run. So it seems like an opportune moment to ask if innovation made in China will go on to change the world. Will Chinese technology power the energy transition? Will Chinese drugs cure our diseases? And most fundamentally, will the systems running our interconnected and digitalized world have been thought of and developed in China? Or will what is clearly a struggling economy with a shrinking working age population and a strong-handed government ultimately mean that China cannot become a leader outside of some highly specific industries? The economic trajectories, not just of China, but of many countries, including those in Europe, and yes, including Switzerland, might hinge on the answer to these questions. But the implications, of course, go far beyond economics. Technology is never neutral, and a world where key systems have been developed in a country with a different history, a different culture, and a different set of policies will have far-reaching implications for all of us. So in short, will innovation made in China change the world? Thank you very much for voting. We will close the poll now and proceed. Excellent. Now it's time, finally, to introduce the teams that you've all come to listen to tonight. As is customary, to leave as much time for debate as possible, I will keep these introductions very short. Their biographies are all on our website if you'd like to know more. On the side arguing in favor of the motion is to my far right, to your far left, James Kynge, who is a writer on Chinese technology, the economy, and geopolitics. He's a former journalist for the Financial Times and has reported there on China for over 28 years. Joining him, arguing for the motion, is John Lee, who is our 2025 Toy Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Switzerland, as well as a fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. We should really shorten that name at some point. I do want to acknowledge that the Toy Senior Fellowship is made possible through the generous support of Max and Monique Burger and the Thinking of Eve family. Monique is here tonight. Thank you very much for the support. John is also a director at the consultancy East-West Futures, and he's returning to the Oxford debates for a third time and the second time live, so he has a bit of a home advantage here. But the other team has brought many good arguments. So on the other side, arguing against the motion that innovation made in China will change the world is on my far left, your far right, Antonia Hmaidi, who is a senior analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERIX in Berlin, where she's working on geopolitics of technology, China's pursuit of tech self-reliance, cybersecurity, and hacking campaigns. Joining her is Yuka Kobayashi, currently a British Academy Global Innovation Fellow in the German Council on Foreign Relations Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and Technology. That's an even longer name than the other. And therefore, she's on leave from SOAS at the University of London, where she's the senior lecturer on China and international politics. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. And now, without further ado, we're going to jump into opening remarks, 5 minutes from each side against the clock. As is customary, the team arguing in favor of the motion will open the debate. So that means, James Kynge, the word is yours for the opening remarks in favor of tonight's motion, innovation made in China will change the world. Please.
Thank you so much, Nico. And thank you to the Asia Society. What a wonderful venue this is. Absolutely fantastic to be here. And may I just say also, what a good-looking and intelligent audience we have in here tonight. Just getting an early strike in there for my maxim that flattery will get you everywhere. I'd also like, before we do battle, friendly battle with our opposition over here, to compliment them on their research. Genuinely speaking, I've been a huge beneficiary of the work that Dr. Hmaidi and Dr. Kobayashi have been doing for a long time. So with that, gloves off. Right. So, yes, the innovation made in China is changing the world, will change the world, and I believe, just to add a little bit, to an extent that we will all be amazed by. Just one little definitional point. Innovation includes product innovation, which is kind of obvious, you make something new, and also it includes process innovation. In other words, improving the process by which you make something in order to make it a lot cheaper, a lot better, and therefore a lot more useful. I just would like to kick off with a few examples. I think many of you will know these examples, so apologies, but I need to set out our stall. BYD, the electric vehicle car company, recently made an announcement that it can charge a battery within 5 minutes in its electric vehicle. That will give it a range of 400 kilometers. This is twice the speed of Tesla's next generation, not available now, twice the speed of Tesla's next generation of supercharger. Sticking with cars, another Chinese company, Xiaomi, I'm sure you've all heard of it, is producing an electric vehicle in Beijing on a production line that it was almost entirely without human beings. If you see this line, there isn't anyone there, and it produces a new car every 76 seconds. But that's not even the most extraordinary statistic with regard to Xiaomi. The most extraordinary statistic is 18. That is the number of months that Xiaomi took to turn from a mobile phone company into a car company. And the reason it was able to do that was entirely because the head of Xiaomi, Lei Jun, is a software engineer by training and a software genius. And he reckons that Xiaomi will now turn from a mobile phone company, a car company, into an AI company. This is innovation, product innovation, and process innovation at warp speed. In the vision of Xiaomi's boss, you're going to have phone, car, home. Your entire ecosystem is going to be assisted by AI that relies on all of these building blocks. It's amazing how quickly that clock goes. I'm just going to have to be quick here. Let's think about renewables. They are changing the world in a rather positive way. The latest Chinese renewable technology is a 20 megawatt wind turbine. This is by far the biggest and most powerful of any wind turbine in the world. It can alone, one of these turbines, can power enough electricity for 37,000 households. And the tip of the blade, when it's turning around, is going at 350 kilometers per hour, as fast as the Chinese high-speed train. So you can see there's a lot of things happening. Let me switch to robotics. Robotics is another area in which China is either leading the US or very close to the US position. The latest robot from a company called Unitree in China called the G1 is able to run over uneven ground like a plowed field. It's able to do Chinese martial arts. It's able to lie on its back and flip onto its feet like that. But the extraordinary thing about this is that because the process engineering, the process innovation behind Unitree is so impressive, the cost of one of these G1s is $16,000 US, whereas the cost of its most competitive rival in the US is $140,000 US. China has developed a hypersonic missile in a much less conducive area of the endeavor, something which the US does not have. So I think, as I tried to explain, with these brief snapshots of world-leading technologies. China is changing the way we live. It will, through trade and exports, change many of the areas of human endeavor. We're talking AI, cars, renewables, military, and many more. So I think you have to agree with the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James Kynge. Slightly over time, but we're going to let that slide. Don't let that affect your votes too much. And we're turning it right over to the team arguing against the motion. 5 minutes for the opening remarks for Yuka Kobayashi. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to join you guys today. And I would just like to echo exactly the same sentiments back to my competitors. But now, as you say, gloves off. Now, we are actually arguing against the motion, mainly because what we just heard about in Chinese technology. Yes, they are making a lot of interesting technological advancements. But however, these things do not exist in a vacuum. These things are regulated. They're actually exercised within a regulatory context. So these kinds of Chinese technologies, when they actually hit Europe or Switzerland, have to actually exist within the context of the social legal system. So given that we actually have the system that is actually highly regulated in Europe, a lot of these things, especially around technology, is linked to what we think about with data. So given that we have sensitivities and different sensitivities to data in Europe and what we actually have in China, these present limitations and a ceiling in terms of the impact that these technologies can have in society. Secondly, the other thing we actually think about is these kinds of wowing technologies also come with specific kind of governance structures and the ways in which we actually deal with these kinds of technologies, use the technologies, exercise the technologies, and deal with sort of issues like data. And is the Chinese model of dealing with this something that a lot of societies would like to emulate? And I would like to ask the question back to the audience. Is it something that many societies want to copy and do the same things that China wants to do? And I think this is a much more difficult question. So this kind of technological advancements being transferred over to other regions have a limitation. And the other things that we want to question here in our position is twofold. The motion is, will innovation made in China change the world? So it's twofold. The innovation made in China, and the second side is change the world. Now, innovation, I come from Japan, so we talked in the 80s and 90s how innovation in Japan was changing the world and actually having an impact in the world. Yes, but are we not conflating this with this debate about rise of Japan or the rise of China? The rise of China is definitely a phenomenon. We can see it everywhere. Chinese investments, Chinese Belt and Road initiatives, China in Europe, it's really all over the headlines. However, this is different to Chinese innovation. And in terms of innovation, and the motion actually asks for this idea of changing the world. It's paradigm shifting, which is a very different thing. So even if you look at things like TikTok, which seemed to be a very interesting phenomena that took the world by storm, you're also needing to question, did the innovation of putting these kinds of clips together with these dances, is that something that's Chinese? The reality is, no, this actually is a copy from Vine, which was an American innovation. So the Chinese are still very good at perfecting these technologies, making these kinds of perfections, which is not really this groundbreaking technology innovation that is going to change the world. So therefore, we are arguing the motion that this Chinese innovation is actually perfecting these things, but not really innovation itself, and is not going to shape the paradigm. And again, if you look at a lot of the things that we actually are debating about, AI and automation, another thing is the limitation on the ways in which China deal with things like data. So we're actually seeing this shift with China stack, US stack, India stack in terms of technologies, but they all have very different positions in data. And one of the things we're actually seeing in terms of China, which I think is a crucial thing that is a negative for this, is that given that data sovereignty has already been decided in China, data and innovation in China is actually going to be isolated in the China stack. For this innovation to reach the world and to be changing the world, it's going to be difficult because taking out this innovation from China to the outside is limited. Again, this is tied to not just the regulations, but also in terms of emulating the China model. do many countries want to repeat what China's doing? And if you look at across the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road, and the Space Corridor, a lot of these questions will be answered. So therefore, we argue in the position of no, because it's not Chinese innovation, it's Chinese kind of improvements, and it is not paradigm shifting and changing the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuka Kobayashi, arguing against the motion in these opening statements. I'm just going to pass it right back to the team arguing in favor, to our Toy Senior Fellow, John Lee, with his rebuttal arguing in favor of tonight's motion. John, please.
Okay, thank you, Nico, and thanks to everyone for coming along tonight to join. I'm glad that the issue of who takes up Chinese technology has been brought to play here. And with respect to our esteemed colleagues, I have to point out that we can think of this as a two-level game. We have the developed world, so the advanced economies where we sit, where despite the campaign that has been led by the United States against uptake of Chinese technology, the restrictions in practice that we see on, let's say, the use of Huawei equipment in telecoms networks, or for that matter, the use of Chinese connected vehicles on our roads, has in practice been very limited. I would suggest the use as an outlier here, and that if you were simply to take a metric, for example, the amount of Huawei equipment that is still in European telecoms networks, after years of the EU encouraging high-risk vendors to be phased out, you will find that it has basically not shifted over the past few years. The reason is that clearly the practical risk that is seen at the coalface by consumers, whether it be industry or individuals, in using Chinese tech is not enough to prevent their adoption. Then the second layer we have is the one that accounts for most of the human race and most of the countries in this world, which is, of course, the developing world. And there I would personally struggle to find an example of where Chinese technology has been rejected en masse for any of the reasons that Ms. Kobayashi just deduced. The reality is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs applies to countries and societies as to people. And the attraction of low-cost Chinese technology simply outweighs the risk that is seen in terms of, for example, the data security issues. When we talk about data security, again, if you look at how that has been handled here in the EU, companies like BYD, whose cars are increasingly frequently seen on our roads, are storing their data in Europe in accordance with European regulation. And the regulatory barrier has simply not proved adequate, never mind consumer preferences, to prevent the uptake of Chinese technology in ways that are potentially transformative. Because to the point as to what we require in terms of a paradigm shift to meet the threshold for tonight, I urge you not to fall into the trap of assuming that because something is adapted from an idea that was first propagated in a Western country, it cannot be transformative. If you look at the way that Chinese technology, often produced through the process innovation that James referenced, has changed the lives of people around the developing world, entire generations that have skipped, for example, straight to using mobile telecoms instead of using landlines as a result, again, of the ability of Chinese firms to provide these technologies at the scale and the price that is needed, then I do not think, at least not in purely quantitative terms, you can deny that this has had a transformative effect. I also have to point out, if we are making this about a contest between China and the Western world, that innovative capacity is relative. And we have to look not just at the impact of Chinese technology, but at the relative impact of its leading competitors, and that, of course, has meant the United States for a long time. Leaving aside the transformation of the global trading system that's underway, if you just look at the attacks on the US science and technology system. Don't take my word for it. Look at the open letter that was published last week by almost 2,000 members of the US National Academies of Science, Medicine, Engineering, in which they described the decimation, their word, of the US innovation ecosystem, the investigation of 50-plus universities in the US, the stripping of research grant funding because their diversity, equity, and inclusivity policy may mention trans people. This is the United States shooting itself itself in the foot on a grand scale, and this will have implications in terms of who is able to roll out a technology faster. Because again, while a car may seem like a car, the things that you can do with a connected car, one that runs on an electric battery, which you can charge to 400 kilometers range in 5 minutes, opens up all kinds of possibilities which we may not see now, but which have great potential, particularly for poorer societies, to be transformative. And who is offering that vehicle, which is priced at less than $30,000 US? It is not an American company. In fact, there is no American company in the running to do so, or European one for that matter. So I submit that it is clear process and other types of innovation are just as paradigm changing.
Thank you very much, John Lee. And last but not least, we are turning to Antonia Hmaidi to deliver the rebuttal arguing against today's motion. Antonia, please.
Yeah, thank you also for having me, and thank you, everyone. I want to start with a counterfactual. What if there was no innovation made in China? I think we might have had 5G sort of rollout a little bit slower. I can imagine maybe there might be a difference on the speed of some of the EV rollout, but also EV rollout in Europe and in the US was not really determined by China so far. So there wouldn't be a massive difference to the world. And that is because Chinese innovation, which comes in, especially in the process innovation form, doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't come in the form of being path-breaking. Just recently, there was this big discussion around DeepSeek, and DeepSeek went viral. Did DeepSeek transform anything? I would argue no. DeepSeek actually is just a way of, of course, a way of delivering the same model faster. Still, the fact that DeepSeek came from China was so surprising. It was so astonishing to many people that it became viral all around the world. If innovation made in China changed the world, that would be a regular thing. And even so, DeepSeek is still just another large language model. It's still not as good, actually, as OpenAI's best models. And it is still a development that could maybe impact the speed of rollout a little bit, possibly. I'm not even sure on that. Because we also have to take into account the counterfactual of if there was no China, there would most likely be European, US, other companies doing very similar things. China has become big not only by sort of creating additional demand, and I would argue to a large extent by taking on the demand from other countries and taking on demand that had already been met. So yes, it's cheaper. Yes, it might be faster sometimes, but it isn't necessarily transforming the world, changing the world. It's also doesn't matter that it was made in China. If China wasn't there, it could have been the same thing, could have been done in Japan. These kind of developments that we're talking about, DeepSeek's development of a faster algorithm, that was something that we have seen sort of building blocks in different countries, in different papers before. So there isn't really a paradigm shift. On the adoption, I would also say that where we are seeing adoption, it is things that would have been adopted anyway, independently of where they're coming from. It's not things that are new in the sense of something that wouldn't have been there. Maybe it would have been slower, yes, but it would have been there anyway. I mean, when we're talking about mobile phones and mobile payment, for instance, I remember 15 years ago, my university in Geneva actually ran big trials with World Bank around mobile payment in the developing world, in India, in Kenya, in many different developing countries. The fact that some of the time China rolled this out in some countries. In other countries, it was Google, it was different companies. It doesn't really make a difference to the material impact and sort of the world. I wouldn't say that it's changing the world in that way. Now, I could bring a lot more examples if you wanted. Huawei's 5G is another such example where Huawei's 5G is great, but it's not significantly better than other people's 5G. And looking at the actual benefits of 5G, it would have been rolled out in most of the world at one point anyway. Huawei might have made it faster, not really a big difference. And this kind of difference in terms of innovation made in China changing the world. It's really, I always come back to this counterfactual of, let's say China still rose, which has changed the world again significantly, but instead of doing it through product innovation and process innovation, it would have done something completely different. And instead, all of the product and process innovation would have come from somewhere else. The world wouldn't be a different place right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonia Hmaidi, with closing the rebuttal. We're not yet at the closing remarks, with the rebuttal arguing against tonight's motion, and then concludes the opening block of the debate. We're moving into Q&A for about 25 minutes. I see many of you have already submitted questions. If you do have a question you would like me to ask our panelists, please submit it through the Slido QR code you see now. You can also, if you scan this code, if you don't have a question, you can go and see all the great and smart questions other people have posed. You can upvote them, and I will try to answer those questions earlier that have more upvotes. And I'm actually, I don't usually do this, but there's one question that is getting so many upvotes, I feel I should just come out with it immediately. This looks like a question for the team arguing in favor of the motion. Could the panel please point the audience to a fundamental discovery or innovation that emerged out of China? John.
Well, without getting into a definitional rabbit hole of what do we mean by fundamental.
Whatever you say it is.
I think that we need to question the premise of the question. And obviously, I'm not debating the various valued audience members who submitted this. But the reality is that we have to remember the larger context here, right? China is a or until recently, was a very poor country, which was generations behind technologically. So it would not be reasonable to expect their system to have produced what we would typically call a fundamental science breakthrough within, let's say, our lifetime or the last 2 generations. As James elaborated on, you have seen a lot of implementation and process innovation, which in real-world terms is often just as important. If you really had to try and isolate something, yes, you could point to certain things with quantum communications, for example, where you have truly groundbreaking work that is being done by Chinese research labs. Often, at least historically in collaboration with foreign actors, but that's a separate issue. There, I don't know if you would describe that as a fundamental breakthrough in the sense that there was a body of work that was being built on. But in that sense, nothing is a fundamental breakthrough anymore, right? We live in such a complex world these days that everyone is building on top of a huge accumulated body of knowledge. So, the supposed 19th century stereotype of the inventor genius simply doesn't apply. To some extent, everything is implementation and is drawing on the cumulative body of human knowledge. And our case is that the Chinese are very well positioned to do that for reasons that I will get more into in the closing statement. I won't inflict that on the audience right now. But James, what do you think?
Yes, I think it's a great question. I just want to give you one example of how I think this is a fundamental change. I mean, there is a definitional issue of the word fundamental, but Dr. Kobayashi, for instance, said that there is no paradigm shift in China. Let me just describe how there is actually paradigm shift. Okay, so Huawei's 5G. Now Huawei has something called 5G-A. This is a telecom system which is 10 times as fast, has 10 times the capacity of 5G. So it does 10 gigabytes per second in terms of the amount of data it can transmit. Now, you may say, okay, well, that's not fundamental. That's not a paradigm shift. That's just speeding things up. Where it becomes a paradigm shift is that the latency on this, the transmission of this data is so low that you can actually give birth to an automated driving ecosystem. In other words, cars get the data so quickly that they can sense where danger is and brake in time to stop. So you can say, well, Huawei moving from 5G to 5G-A is not a paradigm shift. But then when you extrapolate that and you say this is such a huge improvement in the technology that you're giving birth to an entirely new ecosystem of technology, i.e. self-driving cars, I argue it is a paradigm shift. And there are many, many examples like that.
Thank you. Antonia, I wanted to pick up something that John Lee said in his remarks, was that impact is always relative. And while there's probably going to be not a lot of debate on the stage and in this room that in the last decades, the US were the place where most of the technological innovation came from that sort of had an impact on our world. Are you really still comfortable, after all we've seen in the last few months, of arguing that the US will continue to play this role going forward? And if not, who will play it? Is there even an alternative to our innovation in the future coming from China? Or do we just have to live without innovation? It's also an option.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my job has quite honestly become a lot harder in general in the last couple of months. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. However, I actually wouldn't say that the US was, or like US innovation was necessarily the one that was changing the world. I would say Western innovation that was built on an open system that was at this point really facilitated by the US, yes, but that wasn't only US based, was what was changing the world. If we're thinking about a lot of these big innovations, 5G for instance, 4G, 3G before it, arguably that came from Nokia and Ericsson. Those are European companies. They were part of the US-led system at that point that enabled them to work together with Cisco, for instance, on the application side, all of these things. But that wasn't a US-based thing. I don't think it's clear at this point that what's happening in the US will necessarily dismantle the entire system. I think that's actually something that's up to many of us in Europe and in Australia and in India increasingly, in many other countries around the world. Is anyone, and it doesn't need to be one specific entity, it can be a number of entities, picking up the slack on the facilitation? It doesn't need to be picking up all of the different pieces in terms of what was originally coming from the US. The important thing for me is really the facilitation of the free flow of knowledge. And that's what enabled all of this innovation happening. And I don't see China picking that up because they're not big fans of the free flow of knowledge in general. And therefore, I don't want to imagine a world where Chinese innovation is what changes the world. But I also can't really imagine it because, again, Chinese innovation, again, it's a definitional thing. Is it innovation? Is it not? But so far, it hasn't led to the kind of breakthroughs, the kind of paradigm shifts that we would expect to see from a country whose innovation is changing the world.
Thank you. Yuka, your argument rested in large parts also on the fact that Chinese innovation is incremental. There's no paradigm shift. And you also said that there's going to be reluctance, in many societies around the world to pick this up. Now, I think those arguments are convincing. The problem is that 10, 15 years ago, we heard a lot of arguments on why China would never be able to produce a decent car. And I think, if anything, tonight, James has convinced us all to go out and try to buy Xiaomi cars now. So aren't we running a little bit the danger of underestimating China's capacity yet again? What makes you so sure that, in the words of famous economists, this time is really going to be different?
I think one needs to really consider, yes, I mean, going back to the rise of China debate, China is maturing, China is rising, right? But innovation and changing the world, I think there are various limitations here. And I would like to just second what Antonia actually said about innovation. And I think my argument would rest on the fact that innovation is driven by a variety of ideas, variety of people, and variety of these kinds of data being available to improve things. So even if you look at things like AI, it's not this kind of homogeneous data set that actually breeds innovation. It's this kind of varied idea, and this kind of Western model of free flow of ideas and interactions, and going to the G7 statement of trusted data with free flow. It's not data sovereignty that what we actually have in China. So there is this kind of limitation And there is a ceiling there, right? So I'm not saying that they're not going to have any impact. I'm arguing that it's not going to change the world because of these kinds of ceilings on the limitations of this kind of technological advancement.
Right. I want to pick a quick audience question, and I'd love to very quickly here, actually, I think it's a question that would benefit from getting answers from both teams. I'm going to turn to the team arguing in favor first. Will the recent policy decisions by the American president lead to, I'm trying not to say the name, lead to Europe embracing Chinese technology more than before? So again, are we seeing kind of almost the US pushing Europe into China's open innovation and technology arms? James, you're nodding, so.
Yes, I think the short answer is yes. To my way of analysis, I think the Trump tariffs means that China will win the tech war. I always thought that China would win the tech war, but now it's making it much more likely. The reason for that is that I was in Shenzhen a few months ago. Everywhere you go, you talk to Chinese companies and you ask them about how cheap their product is, and then you say, well, what about your closest competitor somewhere else, Japan, the US, Europe, something. And in almost all cases, we visited 24 companies. They were 30%, 40%, even 60% cheaper than their best competitor elsewhere. The tariffs that have just been put on China, although huge, are not in the order of, well, not quite in the order of 40, 50, 60%. And I also think that with potential Chinese responses such as allowing the renminbi to depreciate, subsidizing exports, etc., that should be able to cushion the blow somewhat. So to my way of thinking, what the Trump tariffs do is to heap a world of pain onto manufacturers all over the world. The place that can sustain that pain the best, although it will still very much be hurting, will be China. And I would say that the Chinese trade surplus, which is close to $1 trillion now, having the first round of Trump tariffs back in 2018-19 failed to stop it. I think this round will also fail to stop it, and that will continue to rise.
Thank you. Let me put the question to Antonia as well, maybe with a slight modification. Why will the recent policy decisions from the US not lead Europe to embrace Chinese technology more than before?
I think, if anything, the recent policy decisions from the US show Europe very clearly the danger of dependence on anyone. And Europe, I mean, I'll bring in an example from Germany. I'm German. We've been discussing having a Deutschland stack forever and ever. No government agency was really willing to invest. Just, I think yesterday, the Bundeswehr, so the German military, decided to invest large into a Deutschland stack, into moving away from Office 365. No one even entertained the idea of moving towards Huawei or something like this. Instead, what this is doing is really showing everyone we can't be dependent on anyone. It doesn't matter China or US. There need to be things that we have from our own country. I'll give another example. When the US, and this was Biden back then, this wasn't even Trump, first instituted tariffs on Chinese EVs, which, by the way, were quite unlikely to come to the US directly anyway. One of the major fears I saw around Europe was, would this lead to these EVs going to Europe, to this diversion going to Europe? This is something that would be very desirable from a Chinese perspective, because actually US tariffs on many Chinese goods at this point are 72% or higher, because they're additive. So the fentanyl tariffs that they did 2 months ago actually add onto the current tariffs. So it's actually really, really high. They would prefer to be able to export this to the EU, of course. But the EU is not willing to receive it. And we are also seeing around the world a lot of different countries. Colleagues of mine actually looked at what are developing countries doing to keep Chinese technology out. And they found almost all of the countries that they looked at, which I think was 80 countries, had policies in place to keep Chinese technology out. So it's not as simple as all developing countries are happy to receive Chinese technology because it's cheaper than Western technology. And I think the US tariffs will hurt Europe, they will hurt the world overall. They will also have a negative impact on innovation, quite honestly, around the world. But I don't think they'll push Europe to adopt Chinese technology more, because then China might be able to hurt us the same way the US is now hurting us. And we've seen that China is willing to do so, even now with export controls that, even though they were targeted towards the US, actually also impacted Europe significantly.
Thank you. John, taking other audience questions that I'd love to put to you. China, of course, has the Great Firewall. It does censor quite a bit of content on the internet. There are many websites that are not accessible from within China. There's obviously ways around that, but isn't there an argument to be made that with no full access to all of global knowledge, the country is immediately at a disadvantage for innovation?
Well, that hasn't been obvious so far. I mean, the Great Firewall has been in place since China was connected to the internet, and yet it hasn't stopped the very objective progress that China has made. I think, again, there's different layers that we can work with here, right? We need to avoid the trap again of talking about the efficiency of the Chinese system when we're talking about its innovation potential, because this is, in one sense, a question of absolute figures, like how much Chinese technology is being taken up by the rest of the world. And it's also a comparative one, again, in competition with foreign vendors, right? But if you look at just the factor endowments that China is accumulating, to finish the point about efficiency, it's often said the Chinese system is effective, not efficient, right? It's very wasteful. Often takes a roundabout way of getting where it wants to go, but it produces the result. You throw enough mud at the wall, some of it sticks. That has been shown in industry and technology sector after sector for the past 20 or 30 years. And in terms of the connection to the outside world, that's been talked about quite a lot, how as let's say a siloed system, China's innovation potential would obviously be quite restricted. We are very far away from that. The Great Firewall certainly doesn't achieve that. But even with all of the pressure from politics on Chinese collaborations, I mean, here, the last study that I saw about European collaborations between AI researchers and Chinese counterparts was that they had gone up over the last few years again, which again is in the face of extremely strong messaging that this is a security concern. The final point to make there, I think, is that it's important to remember China is such a large economy that to some extent it's a self-sustaining motor. I mean, we talk about China as an export-driven economy. It's never been an export-driven economy. Like, exports have been very important, but all along, domestic demand has been the key driver of industrial development in China. And you are simply seeing a shift from, obviously, the construction sector and many kinds of fixed asset investment towards more investment in the technologies of the future, which will have the international impacts. I mean, BYD, since it's come up so much today, even today, it's the largest EV maker in the world, surpassed Tesla, as I'm sure everyone's read in the news. That is still based on 90% of sales going to the domestic market in China. Right? This is a Chinese motor which is driving the innovation results in China, which are then being exported or simply spilling over to the rest of the world. So while obviously it will be bad for Chinese researchers and industry to be increasingly cut off from the rest of the world, that's not happening yet in such a systematic way that it would crimp their style. And even if it did, it's far from taking the juice out of the engine. The last thing quickly to say there is that if we're talking about the nature of paradigm shifts, right? If you were talking about any physical system, closed system, right? Would you introduce a huge new quantity of variables to it and expect the behavior of the system to remain the same? Because that's effectively what you are doing with human civilization as a closed system. In the 50s or 60s, there were so many hundred thousands of researchers working in the Western world who were generating many of the technological advances. Today, even if you just look at China and not at the larger world, India and the rest, just a country which is generating hundreds of thousands of STEM graduates a year and putting them into its R&D system, which is plugged into the global innovation systems, why would you expect that system to continue, the larger system, to behave the same way as it did in the 50s or 60s? You have basically a velocity change just by introducing so many new actors and inputs into the innovation system. So regardless of the efficiency of the Chinese system or whatever its contradictions, simply adding this much capacity to the collective human capacity for innovation is going to be paradigm changing.
Yeah. And maybe picking up on this idea of, I think both of you have referred a lot to, sort of the importance of capacity, the importance of scale, and how that actually then become paradigm shifting. Yuka, you briefly mentioned BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. We haven't heard a lot about it in the last few years compared to before, but it's still around. And my question is, given China is both a manufacturing giant as well as a country with a fairly high savings rate, so it kind of has this almost internal pressure of like looking for outside places to put capital in. Isn't that an incredibly powerful vector for Chinese innovation, Chinese technology to travel along the stylized Silk Road and sort of take root in other countries? Why would that seems like a fairly obvious thing that could work. Why is that not playing in China's favor?
I'd like you to imagine a map to answer your question. The Belt and Road Initiative actually connects China all the way through the Central Asian states to Europe. Now, if you fast forward from Xi Jinping announcing it in 2013, what do you actually see? You actually see Ukraine, actually a significant geographical region in the middle, going into war. You also see Russia having sanctions. So essentially, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road Economic Belt is really in trouble. And this is why that, the head of China, the foreign ministry, Wang Yi, actually tries to really bring peace to this area, because the Silk Road Economic Belt is really dead, right? So the idea was there, but really the ways of trying to do it is actually problematic. What I would say, what's changing the world now is a paradigm shift in the mentality. So the mentality is that we're going from a globalized world to a fragmented world of multiple orders. So in terms of changing the world, in terms of China's Belt and Road Initiative, I would argue no, because there's already a big gap in the Belt and Road connectivity platform. It's a connectivity platform, but one that's disconnected.
Thank you very much. We're already getting a little bit short on time, so I want to put two more questions, one to James, one to Antonia, very briefly. Please, James, this is a question from the audience again. We focused, as I think is kind of normal in these kinds of conversations, quite heavily on tech. We've talked about AI, we've talked about electric vehicles. Semiconductors haven't come up that much, but I think they were mentioned. So the question from the audience is, can we expect, and I guess also where and to which extent can we expect innovation outside sort of the narrower tech field, in, for example, finding ways to address an aging population, feeding the world, healthcare, pharmaceuticals. So what are the non-strictly technological areas of Chinese innovation that you think we should be paying most attention to?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I should say that, this technological shift that we're looking at is something that, even though I'm arguing for the motion, gives me deep misgivings. As a journalist, I look at what DeepSeek can do, and DeepSeek can basically do what I do. And so I think, regardless of whether Chinese innovation will change the world, if DeepSeek puts me out of a job, it'll change my world. So I think that's the first thing to say. But when you look at other areas, you always see this dichotomy between very good things and not so good things. Talk about the aging population. So in Shenzhen, we interviewed the head of a huge automation company called Hans Laser. We called the guy the tiredest guy in the world because his schedule just seemed so punishing. He said, I can get up now and I can point to 4 companies that I can see out of the window that are making stuff cheaper than us, and we're making stuff cheaper than our best Japanese competitor. And what they make is industrial innovation. So all of the robots that go into factories. And we said, okay, what does it look like in 10 years' time? Will you have robots helping people with their daily life? And he said, my dream is that in 10 years' time, we will have at least 10 million humanoid robots helping old people in China. He said, you know, when I was young, I took care of my parents. My dream is that my daughter will not take care of me. I will be taken care of by a humanoid robot. And then he said, every time I've made this prediction, I've been too early. But he said, it will happen. It's just a question of when. So I think, you know, the question you raise about aging China is a very good one. Maybe some of the burden for aging China can be assumed by some of the robots.
Thank you very much. Antonia Hmaidi, final question goes to you. We've not really, I think, talked quite as much about the role of governments, and especially the Chinese government. And I think there's a case to be made in both directions. The Chinese government has a strong hand, so it can direct and has in the past directed plenty of resources towards innovations, technologies that it thought was helpful. But it also has a somewhat, shall we say, checkered track record in supporting the winners. So in balance, sort of is the net effect of the Chinese government on innovation positive or negative?
I would argue that the net effect of the Chinese government is negative on innovation. Let's go back to DeepSeek. DeepSeek was actually not a government darling at all. The government darlings didn't come up with DeepSeek or like with a similar innovation. DeepSeek came up with it, and now the government is trying to co-opt the company. And it is very unclear if DeepSeek will continue to innovate, if DeepSeek will continue to be open source, which is one of the things that has led some people to at least consider adopting DeepSeek. Now, with all due respect, James, I think you're a much better writer than DeepSeek. So I would argue there. But even beyond DeepSeek, what we are seeing is that the Chinese government, especially under Xi Jinping, has started the innovation-driven development strategy in 2013. In terms of actual innovation, and it was based a lot on basic science, by the way, because that was one of the weaknesses that they identified, I would argue they've not made a lot of progress. And instead, what they've done is made a lot of the things that we would use to measure progress, the goals, which then makes them completely useless in measuring the progress. Like, how can you measure progress of Chinese innovation with patents if the goal is to get as many patents and you get funding in China for patents? So it makes it difficult for us to understand what's happening. But when we're looking at sort of actual metrics of a lot of the innovation, and when we're looking especially into the parts that might be more removed from the market and therefore would be expecting to play a big role in 10, 15 years, we're not seeing a corresponding shift in China. And I think China has actually probably sort of past the zenith of its innovative power. Because when you're talking to Chinese scientists now, they are scared. I talked to a scientist who's active in quantum in China, who can't travel outside of China anymore, who's scared of not being quick enough in terms of his results, who is unhappy and would like to leave China, but his family is there, so he's staying there. But he's not being as productive as he was 5, 10 years ago, when he could travel freely, when he could go to conferences, when he wasn't worried about really his life. And this is something that we see more and more. Even in the STEM graduates in China now, more and more time is devoted to ideological training instead of STEM training. This is something that's a net negative. And under Xi Jinping, all of this has really gone up tremendously, which is why I think the government of China, especially in this current iteration, is a net negative for innovation for China.
Thank you very much. And with that, we are concluding the Q&A part, at least the first one. I know there are 46 unanswered questions currently, so my apologies to those who did not yet get their question answered. There will be more time later for questions, but it just a show of how important this topic is. So we're going to move it right along to closing statements. Every speaker gets 2 minutes and 2 minutes only. I want to emphasize how little time that is. And we do this in the exact same order as we've had the opening statements and the rebuttals, which means James Kynge, you are first delivering your closing statement, arguing in favor of today's motion. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, I just got 3 10s for you. And these 3 10s, I hope, will convince you not only that Chinese innovation is changing the world, but that this is not a flash in the pan, this is actually a paradigm shift. The 3 10s are the one I mentioned already. Chinese latest generation of telecoms, so the 5G-A developed by Huawei, is 10 times the capacity, with 10 times the speed and 1/10 of the latency of the 5G generation. That will create a whole new ecosystem of products that all work together primarily through AI. 10 times the hypersonic missile that China developed, first one ever in the world, the Americans still can't work out how they did it, is traveling at 10 times the speed of sound. This is no small feat to develop something that technologically excellent, even though, of course, its mission is to destroy. The the robot also that I mentioned is 10 times cheaper. That's the unitary robot compared to the Boston Dynamics robot is 10 times cheaper, and they can do the same thing. So through this extraordinary process innovation, China is creating a whole generation of products across the board, really from one end to the other end of technological endeavor, that are fundamentally different because they are so much better, so much faster, and because they enable a whole new way of thinking and a whole new generational dawn. So I think you have to vote for the motion.
Thank you very much. James Kynge arguing in favor of the motion. Yuka Kobayashi, your closing statement arguing against. You have 2 minutes as well.
Thank you. I think we've actually established that China is very good at perfecting technologies, progressing them. But in terms of innovation, I think it's a different matter. And also, when you look at a lot of the technological advancements, many of these things may be fast, but fast is not always better. And with fast, it also comes with a lot of dangers. And a lot of the things we don't really talk about today, or a lot of the things we talked about today are very much linked, because if you look at technology, it's linked to security. So what we're actually talking about here is a lot of these things can be used for dual use. So here it becomes that another issue in the sense that it's not just faster the better, and there needs to be a lot more thought and nuanced understanding of how we're getting there. So Chinese innovation, or what you might call is technological advancement, is changing China for sure, because it is this kind of society that would accept these kinds of technological advancements in that kind of societal constraint. But is it going to change the world? I think we've already demonstrated it is very limited. There's a ceiling, and in terms of having an impact externally, it is very limited. So we would actually encourage you to vote against the motion that Chinese innovation will not change the world. It is changing China, but not the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John Lee, your closing statement arguing in favor of the motion.
Sure.
2 minutes as well.
So 3 points to bear in mind. The first is that this is not about value judgments or efficiency. We may want to live in a world that is not populated with Chinese tech, but that's not the motion. The motion is, will the world be increasingly populated with Chinese tech? And likewise, the question is not how efficient the Chinese system is. Everyone's familiar with its limitations. But in absolute terms, is it contributing ever more things that we can call innovation to the system in China, and if for no other reason than just by spillover effect to the rest of the world? I think that my debating partner and I have demonstrated this. I would just highlight on the issue of a ceiling for the potential of Chinese technology. Again, while there may be inefficiencies in the Chinese system, they have not in practice proven able to stop the development of technologies in China or their uptake overseas, if we talk about the security concerns. Second point, China is not an isolated system. As I've banged on about, Chinese researchers, despite all of the political pressures, Chinese companies are still participating in global industries, academic networks, and even if they lost access to that, they can read English, they can get AI to read English for them, they still have access, because their government does give it to them, despite the political censorship, to the signals if nothing else, and the substantive knowledge often that's generated elsewhere in the world. And the final point, where will future innovation come from? We've talked a lot about the supply side, the generation of it, but it's also very much about the demand. Innovation will come where the market demands it, and increasingly that is in countries which are much more open to Chinese technology, specifically the fast-developing economies of the third world. So I will leave you with those 3 points in favor of the motion.
Thank you very much, John Lee. And again, final word goes to Antonia Hmaidi, 2 minutes closing statement arguing against today's motion, please.
Perfect. Who of you has used WeChat outside of China? I haven't, unless to communicate with China and Chinese people. Do you use it to communicate with people here without? Oh, interesting. That is surprising to me, honestly. I do not. Okay. That is surprising to me. Does it do something substantively different to WhatsApp? WhatsApp and PayPal, maybe, in that case. It's only one app, sure, okay. For me, it's not changing my world. It hasn't changed my world using it in China. It's not changing my world being able to use it here or not being able to use it here. And this, to me, is really emblematic of how we see Chinese apps in sort of, and also Chinese technology, Chinese innovations, however you want to call them, is they're great. A lot of the times, they're cheaper in China. Not having them doesn't have a big impact on me currently, and I don't think it has a big impact on the world as a whole. Because WeChat was developed originally because WhatsApp wasn't available in China. So they started with the same features. TikTok, which arguably has changed the world, was developed from Vine, as we outlined before. A lot of it is innovation that doesn't have to be from China. The coincidence is more that it's from China than sort of the innovation as such, which is why it has not changed the world. And I think it also won't change the world, because as we also outlined, the future for Chinese innovation or innovation made in China is not necessarily bright currently. And that's something that even a lot of Chinese technologists agree with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonia Hmaidi. And that concludes the closing statements for today's Oxford debate, which means it is time again for you to vote for a second time. Please scan the Slido QR code. The question is the same. Do you agree or disagree with today's motion? And because we've talked quite a bit over the last hour or so, we will let you now vote for about 45 seconds in complete silence. And now, I hear that the results are here. And we're now put them on the screen. I have not seen them. So before the debate, 78% agreed with the motion and only 17% disagreed. After the debate, only 69% agreed with the motion, whereas 24% disagreed, which means that the team arguing against the motion, Antonia Hmaidi and Yuka Kobayashi, has won tonight's Oxford debate. Congratulations and a big applause. Of course, gentlemen, you can find solace in the fact that you retain a majority behind you. So in a way, you're also winners. It's a nice thing about the Oxford debate. Everybody wins.
No, that's not actually the case, Nico, when you say that.
Exactly. Excellent outcome. Thank you very, very much.